you very much, Adam. Delighted to join you here today. My name's David Howard-Jones. I'm partner in Wyman, where I focus my time on helping our clients with matters of risk, governance, and innovation. And it's on the innovation topic that I'm joining you here today, and I'm delighted to be joined by Lynn Kraus, who's CEO of Australian Payments Plus, and Brad Carr, who's got a complex title around national digital engagement and innovation at NAB. Now, we're very spoiled to have Brad and Lynn with us today. Brad is back at NAB, sandwiching two roles there between 7 years at the Institute of International Finance in Washington, DC. And Brad's face may be well known to many of you in the room because you'll have seen him here multiple times, anchoring the IIF's annual, maybe not through COVID, but regular visits to Australia to run their own conference. Lynn is a relatively recent joiner to Australian Payments Plus, which was formed 16 months ago in the bringing together of FPOS, BPay, and NPP. And she joined Australian Payments Plus, I'll call it AP Plus to save a few vowels, off the back of multiple leadership positions at EY, 15 years there as a partner. So welcome both of you. We're going to talk today about digital identity, and I have to confess first, I'm a bit of an early adopter, so I have 5 banking apps on my phone, I have 3 digital ID apps. I'm probably a little bit of an outlier. But digital identity in Australia has not been a happy story. Some of you in the room will remember the Stalin card, or the Australia card, as the government liked to call it in the 1980s, which was a centralized identity scheme. The world we're in today is very different. So we saw through COVID that individuals are very happy to share private information where the need is clear for things like COVID tracking apps and tracing. And additionally, what the government is proposing through the Trusted Digital Identity Framework, so another acronym, TDIF, is very different from the Australia card, and we're going to hear a little bit more about that today. In any case, delighted to have you both with us, and perhaps on the challenge of privacy, this big question that goes back to the 80s. Lynn, how do you think about privacy? How do people feel about privacy today? And how's that going to influence adoption of digital ID?
Well, I think we've seen thanks for having me. I think we're seeing a real shift to your point where there was people not really thinking about how much of their information they were giving out, to much more a view that people want to give consent, right? Consent is really important, and consent to not only sharing data with whom, but to what level you want to share. And I think we've seen, obviously it was mentioned when Adam brought us up, we've seen quite a few tragic incidents here in Australia over the last 10 to 12 months, which I think has heightened it even more, that people really want to have control of their data. I think we're also seeing that corporates are wanting to make sure that they're minimizing data and only seeking to take on the data that they really need to identify an attribute for an individual. So I think we're seeing a real shift from sharing it all to really bringing it back in, which is where solutions like Connect ID and MyGov really play a role.
And what do you think that's going to mean for adoption? Because, Brad, we've got 6 million Australians have signed up to MyGov ID already, but it's only used for 1 digital login a day.
Yeah.
So we have a big adoption problem. How much of that is linked to privacy, and what do you think the sector needs to do to drive adoption?
Yeah, look, thanks, David. I think maybe firstly I'd take a step back and to Lynn's point there around privacy and privacy awareness and privacy consciousness. I think the legacy of the Optus and Medibank events last year were really that we have a heightened consciousness around privacy, around data protection, and on wanting to minimise the level of personal data that you have transmitted. And I think at NAB we look at it that we really have our customer bases broadly in 2 sets, where we have consumers who have that heightened consciousness and would prefer to minimise how much of their data is transmitted. But we also have, as Lynn was alluding, we have our business customers who historically have taken copies of passports. In the case of small businesses, not always had the resources around how that's stored and protected. And that's a great challenge, and increasingly those firms are finding added liability either in reputation or in terms of the Privacy Act amendments. So I see 2 different sets of our customers that are feeling pressure or feeling pain in this space. And the fact that, of course, we do undertake a very rigorous KYC process in identifying our customers, I think it means that we're in a position that we have the opportunity, but I think also the societal obligation, to step forward and provide the connectivity between those groups of actors. such that the business doesn't need to take a copy of your passport, where it could rely on a bank attestation that yes, Brad does live in this postcode, or yes, Brad's date of birth was at least 18 years ago. You don't need to transmit the raw data, but rather we're in a position that we can provide some of that attestation. So I think that's the opportunity and why I think we and the other banks collectively all have a role. And it's not something that one bank can solve on its own. It needs to come together through AP+. But to your point on adoption, you know, I look to the Nordics and to Bank ID in Norway and in Sweden, and you have 99% penetration amongst people aged 20 to 60 that use Bank ID as their verifying tool. And the average user uses it 220 times a year. So they are using it constantly because it's your connectivity to get to everything, to your tax records, to your health records, as well as to your financial records. I think that's what we need to aspire to, because otherwise we'll end up with this fragmented approach where, you know, I had to reset my Gov ID password recently because I'd forgotten it because it's that long since I used it. If you use different things for different purposes, the end result is people probably don't use them at all.
Do you think the government's prepared to take the steps Norway did, though? Because with Bank ID, it's one particular private sector offering. But if you go on the government website, it talks about you can use a digital identity, for example, Bank ID, and it doesn't mention any other ones. I can't imagine Canberra pushing one solution like that.
No, and I don't think we want to have one solution. I think the nomenclature is important. We need to have a unified national framework, but not a singular national scheme or a singular national system. It needs to be a framework in which, as a citizen or as a consumer, you have the choice of, I'll use my bank, I'll use NAB, or I'll use Westpac, or I'll use Bank of Queensland to verify me, or I'll use Telstra, or I'll use Australia Post, or I'll use my Gov ID, or I'll use Services New South Wales. It needs to be an ecosystem in which the consumer has the choice, and that choice is respected, but that in using the verifying party of their choice, they can then get to all of the services in the economy that they need to.
And Lynn, this sounds like a chance for an advert for you guys. So isn't this what Connect ID is doing?
Well, it is. And I think, the framework is really important. I think fundamental to the TDIF framework, which we've been accredited and re-accredited on, is choice. So I believe there is a place for both private and public sector identity solutions. The key is interoperability. But to your point around driving adoption, it is about trust, right? You need to trust. And I think Brad couldn't have said it better. The banks have got amazing systems, cyber postures, risk postures. They have processes in place. And for us, having been a network operator, even though AP Plus is a new organization, FPOS has been around for 30 years, BPay has been around for 25 years. We have great capability at running that network. And so we do have a unique role to play, which is allowing the relying parties, so to speak, which would be the merchants, the customers, the end users, to be able to access what they need through the banks that they already trust. I think recent research that we undertook back in December showed the trustworthiness of banks has continued to increase in a post-COVID world. So you already have all of my data, so why would I not allow you to be the one source of truth? But to Brad's point, there are different use cases. If I'm onboarding an employee and I want to do that quickly through a solution like Connect ID without getting all the paperwork and the payroll details, I might use my bank. If I'm in a role where I need to verify that I have a working with children check, I might go through MyGov. So I think there are multiple use cases that will drive people to different solutions for digital identity, but the key is that they are interoperable. They are open, and I think to drive adoption, you really need that scale.
And under the TDIF, you have to be accredited to be playing in
Correct.
the ecosystem. There are multiple systems
That's
accredited
right.
already, including Post and other ones.
That's right.
How do you think about the UK experience, where I think there were 7 accredited systems and they've had a few drop off and they're down to 2, I think, now?
Do you want to take that?
How do we in
It's
Australia
interesting.
manage that risk that we need momentum for people to sign up?
Yeah, we do. And I think probably the challenge in the UK system is that at the risk of perhaps being a little critical of another jurisdiction, their banks haven't collaborated terribly well in actually bringing it to market as an industry-wide solution. And that's why I think it's so crucial that Australia Payments Plus is playing that role here. It doesn't work for me at NAB to go and put a proposition to my small business liquor store that, hey, I can validate 25% of your customers for you, and you're going to need to go and connect with other people to do the other pieces. The UK has struggled with bringing together that degree of collaboration. So I think there's a clear lesson for us, certainly from that. And it's one that we want to build on in that, as Lynn says, as an industry, we are well placed as a starting point. But we're not advocating a bank closed shop here. And there is indeed the different use cases, the different levels of assurance. If it is a working with children check, if it's those types of scenarios in the care industry is very different from am I able to fish in these waters?
Yep.
But we need to be careful that sometimes we're talking about validating identity, and sometimes we're actually just talking about validating one identification attribute. Are you eligible to fish in these waters? Are you eligible to rent a car? Is your date of birth at least 18 years ago? So we want to have the versatility in the system that it can both ratchet up and down in terms of the level of assurance that's needed and the level of verification or identification that is actually shared, and that we're not necessarily oversharing. There's a great quote today from David Birch in the UK, since you prompted me on the UK, and David's a great expert in this space, and his comment was, we need to think of it perhaps less so much about digital identity and more about digital entitlement. And it's actually about what identity attributes do not need to be shared on a particular transaction,
Yep.
Which generally is actually most.
Yep.
So if we can have a scheme, have a framework that different schemes can participate in under consistent rules with the customer empowered as to which attributes are being shared, I think that's the direction we really want to take.
And that customer empowerment is just so important, and the way Connect ID has been built is that you will be able to see where you have consented for your identity details to be shared, what level of information has been shared. It's never an enduring consent, so you will have to re-consent even if at the same place. And I think that's a real positive because it puts the consumer really in charge of their data. I love when you say collaborate with lots of competition lawyers in the room, mind you, as we've gone through the journey together. But it has been a really unique collaboration, and AP Plus has been lucky to be in that space because we do have quite a diverse membership group that isn't just about the banks, it also is the retailers. Woolies and Coles are members of AP Plus as well. And so I think for anything in payments or in identity, you need that network effect. And so being able to see both sides of that, identity providers and those who might rely, has made it really unique. There's other great examples in Europe. We can see in Germany, we can actually see in Canada with Interac. Bank-led digital identities are getting acceptance, some ranges between 70 to 90%. So huge paths to follow from others where it has been a bank-led solution.
Yeah. So NAB is going to be one of the first banking partners on Connect ID.
Yes.
And to that point about needing the sector to collaborate to make this succeed rather than compete with their own solutions, how does NAB think about that playing out?
Yeah, well, we need the full industry, and obviously this is starting with the four major banks, but I very much encourage the others to join and to participate as well. But actually, it actually needs more of the extension into the international collaboration as well.
Correct.
I think one of the shortcomings of a lot of the digital identity initiatives elsewhere around the world, and particularly government sector ones, is they've tended to focus uniquely on citizens. And we are in large part also a migrant economy in Australia, and we do have significant trade flows as well as remittance flows. So it's not just about NAB and CBA and Westpac coming together here, but it's actually we need to take that one step further and be able to link with Wells Fargo and ICICI and DBS and HSBC, and to be able to support the person that's coming to Australia, trying to get established in life here, have the means to recognise their trade credentials as well as their income history, etc. And similarly for Australians that are going overseas. So, I see it very much as a collaborative exercise that, as an industry, we have a role to play. And it is about us playing that role together with government, together with telcos, together with other sectors. It's us giving our customers their choice.
And with Connect ID as kind of the glue or the rails for communication between it, how far are you down the path on thinking about collaborating with an ICICI to accept their tokens or
since the beginning?
Fargo? Since
the beginning. And what's interesting is when I came into AP Plus just over a year ago, there were two teams working on this solution. So FPOS were leading a solution that was very merchant-led, and BPay were working with the banks. From the beginning, we have always had in mind the interoperability internationally, and making sure that we would be ready. Obviously, we don't control the regulation timetable around those things, but when that becomes open and possible, we've absolutely designed in mind to be able to deliver that.
And will that also feed into KYC and cross-border transaction regulation satisfaction?
Yes, that is the intent. That is the intent. But we're starting. Let's be clear. We're starting with some of the base use cases. We really want to prove what works here before we get there. But the intent would be yes.
I think if I can add to that. So I think from perspective of our bank, and I think of each of the majors, AML obviously has been a public and controversial area in recent years. I don't think there's a risk appetite for us to be not doing KYC ourselves and for us to be relying on KYC that we import elsewhere. However, importing that KYC data from elsewhere can be a worthy complement. And it may well be that over and above what we're already doing in our own processes and practices, where we can bring in additional insights that help to elevate the frauds and scams detection agenda, that's certainly something that we see opportunity and we welcome.
Yeah.
And we've talked quite a lot about privacy, but also how the system will work. And I am keen to get on to the productivity angle as well. There's one last thing on privacy. So anyone who's looked at the TDIF, our system here allows multiple identities. So I have my 3 apps on my phone. I have 3 providers out there who have a different identity for me. The system allows multiple identities. How are we going to guard against fraud? Because it might be quite hard for individuals to track and prevent their ID being stolen.
Well, I think firstly, this is a measure to combat the fraud agenda for the fact that, as Lynn said, the customer is going to be able to monitor where they have given consent for a particular attribute to being passed. They're passing a required attribute rather than necessarily their full identity each time. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there in helping to combat that. But I also think, and I realise resilience has been a heavy word through the morning session here already, but there's also a point of resilience in the system that, regrettably, and to be a bit dark for a moment, somebody is going to suffer a denial of service attack at some point in the future. And when that happens, it will be great that our consumers and our businesses will have multiple avenues or multiple choices as to where they can achieve the required validation and that their economic activity can go on. So that if you have the choice of using MyGovID or Services New South Wales or NAB or Westpac or Telstra, and if the one that you would ordinarily use is out of service on a particular day, you'll have the ability to use one of the others. And I think that's just a really important point of mitigating the impact of some of, mitigating the consequence of some of the great security challenges that our economy is going to stare into.
Yeah. And I think even one step further, obviously right now Connect ID is a scheme in of itself, but if you, earlier this morning when we were talking about the modernization of payments, obviously we see the future potential to embed the identity solution into the payment flow. And so it's not a standalone, which we think will go a long way in frauds and scams to actually be able to digitally identify the person that you're paying.
Lynn, you mentioned Canada earlier. One of the early use cases in Canada under the DIAC Trans-Canadian Trust Framework was about being able to validate that in our language, BSB and account number and name actually match before you make the payment, so that to deal with things like the invoice theft scenario, or the email interception, the person that you're paying to have done your driveway, that it is actually who it is. That's a great opportunity.
So moving on to productivity and value, how do you see that playing out? What do you see as the benefits? What's the business case? How's it going to fund the massive investment in building it? And how are we going to communicate that to the community?
I think there's been lots of research done on this around the world, but in Australia, I think the stats tell us that it's a 3 to 4% GDP positive thing if we move to digital identity. And I think that comes from a number of sources. One, while it won't be the silver bullet for scams and frauds, there is a role to play there in mitigation. But I think to the point that Brad was making earlier, the cost to corporates of acquiring data, storing data, making sure it's secure, purging it every 7 years, wherever the rules land, means that there is a real cost to business, which does eventually make its way somehow to consumers. So I think there's a number of different angles where we see a huge uplift to productivity.
I'm looking at it less from our own productivity within our firm and more the broader economic productivity that we can help support, and in particular dealing with firms that are otherwise going to have very costly and complex solutions needed to mitigate their own liabilities. So I think that's a great contribution that we can help to support economic productivity as a whole. David, you alluded there to the business case and the cost and the investment. I go back to, you mentioned my Washington history. I'll give you a couple of stats that just blew my mind from those times. The top 10 US banks spend more on AML CTF than the FBI's total operating budget. And the top 5 UK banks spend more on it than the UK government spends on prisons. And against all of that, the estimates from Interpol and Europol have been that as an industry, we successfully interdict between 1% and 2% of illicit flows. So that's a pretty terrible return on investment that we're seeing as a global industry at the moment. I don't think the requirements for making those investments are going to go away anytime soon. So I kind of see it a little bit as we're already making these investments. And so rather than viewing it as a substantive new additional cost, it's actually how do we leverage the investments and the capabilities and the consumer trust that we already have in order to be able to apply a productivity uplift into the economy.
Those are great stats around the cost of AML. Obviously, there's going to be plenty of people in the room who agree with that being quite a burden on the industry. How do you get people over the line, though? So back to the numbers of adopters so far. We have 6 million Australians signed up to MyGov, which you'd have thought is one of the most trusted, most easy to give your data to, but it's barely used. Right? So 25 million Australians. Okay, you can cut out the children for now, so we have less far to go than you might think, but still, millions of people don't have it. Millions of people perhaps don't even have, half the country doesn't have a passport, so maybe can't access some of these things. What does the adoption curve really look like for digital ID?
And you've got some great use cases around how this drives inclusive behaviour that we might not otherwise have.
Yeah, correct. I think it's important that we are not just looking at digital identity as how can we digitalise the identities that we've already got today? Because there are a number of people in our community that are not well served by the identities that we have today. We have people that are born without birth certificates. You have people in our remote Indigenous communities who don't have the government documentation that we take for granted. One of the use cases that HSBC in the UK got into quite closely was supporting people like the victims of human trafficking, where they found that quite often when their AML team did some great work in helping to break up a human trafficking ring, that the victims were often, 6 months later, sucked back into the same activity because they didn't have an identity, they didn't have a pathway to re-establish themselves in society. Same for a lot of the homeless. The UK HSBC launched the No Fixed Address initiative on that. So I think we need to look at how are the ways that we as firms can onboard customers who don't have those, if you like, traditional or expected government documents. Where can we establish sufficient trust, whether it's from a particular charity or from a village elder that's able to vouch for them, that enables us to onboard them with confidence? And then we can provide that connectivity for those people into other areas of their economic and social life. I think that's a really significant opportunity but we've got to think outside the prism of just how do we digitalise what we already do.
Yeah, and I think through trust and to your question, I think scale and reach are really important here, right? It needs to be seamless, it needs to be easy to use. If you can use your Face ID to get on your banking app, then that will make it nice and easy to verify who you are. So I think all of those kind of elements, I think can help drive adoption.
And looking forward, Lynn, do you have a sense of when we'll be at 10, 15 million Australians regularly using digital ID?
We hope that we will be there. Our assumptions are really based on it's a 2 to 3 year journey, but we are ready to go very shortly. We're on the cusp. We're on the eve, so to speak, of launch with a few of the major banks, and we do think it will help to drive adoption.
So that's just a few weeks away, isn't it?
It is about to birth the baby, so to speak.
Very exciting. I'm looking forward to my 3 apps getting a ping from you. Very interested in getting questions from the room, because I know that everyone in the room, certainly if they've arrived from overseas and tried to put a cheque into an Australian bank, as I did 15 years ago, it certainly was a painful process, and we're finding smarter ways to interact with various institutions. Are there any questions from the room for Lynn and Brad?
Hi, this is Kapil from Oliver Wyman. My question is, we've spoken a lot about the choice and the collaboration since morning. What are some of the implications being thought through, around giving this choice to customer to use a channel for the identity validation, and also the collaboration that's set out amongst the parties to share and how much to share? So it'll be good to get some thoughts around that.
Yep, maybe I'll take the first one,
Sure.
you take the second one. So I think the user experience is really important to allow that, that choice. So one user experience could be in, say, retail or online, where you're at your checkout, and then it will ask you, I think this is coming, it was supposed to be 1st of July for New South Wales, but has been moved out, where if you're buying online for Dan Murphy, you're gonna need to be able to identify online that you're over 18. You will have the option at that point, and all of the identity providers within Connect ID will be there on your screen for you to choose which one might it be. For this purchase, it might be my bank, or it might be my Gov, could be Australia Post, whoever else the identity providers are that are in the scheme. And so you'll have that choice. It will actually be in your app as well, though, to allow you to see where you've provided it. Do you want to take the second part of that, Brad?
Well, probably building on that. So, the important point is that the consumer has to give consent, and they need to give consent both on who is going to give the attestation on their behalf, whether that's NAB or whether that's somebody else, and they need to give the consent as to which specific attributes. And I really favour what we call a zero knowledge proof, that it's not send us Brad's date of birth, it's answer the yes or no question, was Brad's date of birth at least 18 years ago? So I think that's where we want it to come together in the singular interface for the consumer, the singular point of connectivity for the business that they're tapping into the Connect ID exchange. But within that, the consumer has that control. The other reason why I think the consumer choice is important is, to be a little bit glib about the alcohol example. Like, not everybody wants Medicare to know that they bought alcohol. That's and so being able to give people that choice of, hey, I might actually be comfortable with my GovID for some particular services, I might not. But if it's able to come together through a singular interface and I can control who's got access to what parts of my data, what parts shared, that's the aspiration.
And a huge part of what we're doing in bringing on the relying parties is being really clear about what use cases they need to solve for with identity, and therefore what level of information. So I think that's really important, that it is limited to what do you need to solve for that. There are many times we've probably all stood, I have, at a desk at JB Hi-Fi trying to get a mobile phone for a teenage child, and I've been there for a long time having to give lots and lots of information that you really probably have given more than you really needed to be able to get that mobile phone service. So we're really challenging what level of data do you really need to be able to verify this identity, and keeping it as minimal as possible.
If I can add, and forgive me for giving a little bit of a plug for an upcoming activity, but at NAB we're convening with different people across the industry and academia and government in having a design sprint, looking at particular use cases and then what's the framework needed to support that as we industrialise it. And it's the proof of age was a fairly simple use case for us to launch with. But some of the popular ones that we've heard advocated are around employee onboarding and around people renting properties. And that those are particular areas where at the moment there's extensive demands for oversharing personal information, as well as the care industry and the working for children. They're some of the priority use cases that we're focusing on.
Do we have another question over here?
One on the side.
Thank you. You spoke a lot about the consent process, and the customer will be able to see what attributes are being shared, and it sounds very similar to the consumer data right. So I'm just wondering how it overlaps between the consumer data right or separates from the consumer data right, the differences there.
Well, we've had a mind to CDR as we have developed things. But obviously they are separate, but I think what we don't want to build is something that won't be future-proof, in the same way that Pay 2 has been built to think about use cases that will also conform with CDR.
Presumably though, consent could in a future world either go through Connect ID or not for CDR. Is that how you see it playing out? Because the person needs to verify it is them giving consent for CDR.
That's right.
I mean, it's a different type of consent that you're actually giving in terms of what data is transferred. but it is very much the same principle, that the consumer is empowered as to what's being shared from whom to whom.
Yeah.
And I think we do need to be conscious of, there was an article recently about the notion of consent fatigue amongst our population, and we do need to make sure that the consumer interface is simple and easy to use and not duplicative.
Well, with that, we're going to have to wrap up. Brad, Lynn, thank you so much
thanks
for sharing your thoughts and experiences. Everyone look out for Connect ID turning on, the most famous payment rails in who you are that you'll never know about, because you'll have your own app, which will just be popped up in Dan Murphy's when you're looking for a beer.
Can I ask one question? Can I ask one quick question on exactly
Sure.
that? So I can understand why privacy advocates, etc., are totally on board with this, but your Dan Murphy's and your retailers, why will they come to the party? Because for them, the data is the oil, the more data, the better. And secondly, even if we manage to change this now, isn't there just so many oceans of data? When these breaches were happening last year, people were going, I did one panel with it, there was a banking person saying, look, we're required by law to keep some stuff for 7 years, and a woman from a university on the panel was having a giggle. I said, what's so funny? She said, they're required by legislation to keep some data for 75 years. Now, unless you want to go back and protest an exam result from the 1960s, I don't understand why.
Yeah.
So is there can we ever do anything to hoover up all the stuff that's out there, or is that gone?
I would challenge a little bit, Adam, because I think years ago, everyone was like, data's going to bring rivers of gold, right? I think people are a little bit, what is it for? Why do we need it? What's the cost of us protecting it, securing it? I think there's a different view. And the reality is, for someone like a Dan Murphy, if we continue to go the way we're going, 80% of the payment's going to be made on a mobile phone that's not regulated here. The user's invisible, right? The user's invisible, right? So I think they're already dealing with that.
Can I add, and I'll challenge your notion of the data is the new oil, which is a horrible analogy, but I much prefer the one that Scott Farrell uses, that data is the new uranium, in that its value decays over time, it has a half-life, but also it's toxic. It's toxic, and you've got to store it, and you've got to secure it. So, I think we are going through that evolution, as Lynn alludes, that, data, yes, okay, we've thought about data as an asset, but it's also a liability.
Yep.
A wonderful discussion. Please thank Lynn Kraus and Brad Carr, steered by Mr. Digital Identity himself, David Howard-Jones. Thank you so much, guys.
You.
Wonderful, wonderful.